We need to come up with some rules how to add sign numbers. For example, if I gave you 4 plus a negative 3, and I say, what's the answer? By the way, I have a habit, just me, I have a habit, I put all the negative numbers in parentheses. Doesn't matter if you put them or not, but that's just my habit. What's negative 5 plus a negative 7? What is negative 15 plus 10? What's 8 plus 7? We can answer one question right now, 8 plus 7. We should know the answer to that. That's what? 15. Because the numbers, we've done that, but we never dealt with it with positive and negative numbers. So how do we add when you have positive and negative numbers? And the rule is straightforward. Here we go. If the numbers have the same sign, if the two numbers have the same sign, what do you want to do? Add the absolute value of the number. Add the absolute values and keep the sign. Notice these two numbers were the same. We add them without the sign, 8 and 7, 15. These numbers have the same sign. If we add the 5 and 7, which is what? 12, and we keep the sign. So if the two numbers have the same sign, just add the numbers without the signs and leave the sign alone. What about if the numbers have different signs? Subtract the smaller, we're talking about the absolute value, the smaller absolute value from the larger one, and take the sign of the number with the larger absolute value. The larger absolute value. So let's look at these guys. These two have different signs. Subtract the smaller absolute value from the larger one. What's the absolute value for negative 3? 3. What's the absolute value of 4? 4. Subtract 3 from 4. What's 3 from 4? 1. And take the sign of the number with the larger absolute value. This one has the larger absolute value. What's the sign of that? Positive. So basically, don't pay attention to the sign. In translation, don't pay attention to the sign. Subtract the smaller number from the larger number and take the sign of the larger. That's what this one is telling you. Here's two numbers with different signs. Don't pay attention to the signs first. Subtract the smaller number from the larger number. 10 from 15. 5. What's the sign of the larger? Negative. That's a negative 5. When the two numbers have the same sign, don't pay attention to the sign. Add them and keep the sign. Much easier than all this definition. And what I'm going to do now, just give you problems and practice on these. I'm not going to take absolute value and do all the gibberish stuff, we can do them in our head. Minus 3 plus a minus 1. Look at the two numbers. Same sign or different signs? Same. So what do? Add them, 1 and 3, 4, and keep the sign. Add them and keep the sign. What is negative 2 plus 9? Same sign or different signs? Subtract the smaller from the larger. 2 from 9. And what's the sign of the larger? Positive. We never put the plus sign, just write 7. Negative 35 plus 35. Yep. Well, different signs. Subtract them. Well, 35 from 35? 0. 0 does not have a sign. You try it. Negative 2.1 plus 0.8. Same sign or different signs? So go ahead, see if you can figure the rule. You subtract the smaller from the larger, right? So what's 2.1 take away 0.8? 8 from 1 we can't, right? This becomes 1, that's 11. 8 from 11, 3, and 0 from 1, which is 1. So it's 1.3. And what is the sign of the larger? Positive or negative? Negative. You try this one. Negative 3 plus 1 plus 8 plus a negative 6. Do 2 at a time. What is negative 3 plus 1? Yep, you subtract the smaller from the larger, which is 2. And what's the sign? Minus. Let me copy the rest of the problem. I have enough paper, don't worry about it. Now the next one. Minus 2 plus 8. Same sign or opposite sign? Opposite. Subtract the smaller from the larger. 6, and what's the sign of the larger? Positive. And the last one is what? Different signs, subtract them. 6 from 6. And what's the sign? 0. Now some of you probably learn a different way when you have numbers like these. You probably learn to take the negative numbers and make one number out of them. So add this to this, because they're both negative, What's minus 3 plus a minus 6? When they're the same sign, what do? Add them and keep the sign. What's 3 and 6? 9 with the sign minus. Take the positive numbers, add them, and make one number out of them. These are the positive numbers. What's 1 plus 8? 9. Now you subtract these numbers because they're different signs. 9 from 9? 0. So when you have a lot of numbers, a chain of them, that's a common practice. You'll take all the positive numbers, make one number out of them, add them. Take all the negative numbers, make one number by adding them, then do whatever you need to do. Let's give you another one like this. And you can do it any way you want to. Now when I do this, I'm going to do it both ways. I'm going to grab the first two numbers and I look at them and I said 3 plus a negative 1. These are opposite signs. So what happens when you add opposite signs? Subtract the smaller from the larger. 1 from 3. 2, and what's the sign of the larger? Positive. Let me write the rest of the problem. Now we take the next two. Notice they are what? Opposite signs. Subtract the smaller from the larger. 2 from 8. 6, and what's the sign of the larger? The absolute value, when I say larger, negative 6, right? Now again, opposite signs. Subtract the smaller from the larger, absolute value-wise. 2 from 6. 4, and what's the sign of the larger absolute value? Negative. And finally, these two have the same sign. You add them, and you keep the sign, which is what? Negative 15. Again, the other way of doing it, which is a lot faster and probably easier. We take all the negative numbers, we make one number out of them. We add them into one number. What's 1 and 8? 9 and 11? 20, right? That's a negative 20. There's the plus sign. Take all the positive numbers and add them. 2 and 3? 5. Now notice these numbers are what? Opposite in signs. Subtract the smaller from the larger. 5 from 20. 15. What's the sign here? Negative. Is that the same answer? 2 steps. Now I'm going to continue with the video. So if you understood the multiplication, the addition, well, the subtraction is really nothing but continuation of this. So I'm going to the next section. So this video will have both sections on it. How do we subtract? That's section 7.3. subtractions of sign number. And the rule I'm going to use is this one. We have a rule in methods if you want to subtract two numbers, a minus b, that is really the same as a plus the opposite of b. Notice what I did. Let's pay attention slowly. I changed that minus sign to a plus. So the first value did not change. So the first one didn't change. The second one, I changed the minus to a plus. And what happened to the third piece? I took the opposite of that. So if I said to you, what is 5 minus 3? And we could have given you some set of rules for that, but we decided not to. Because this equation says you can use the same rule you just learned for addition if you do one extra step. And that is, leave the first number alone. Change this one to addition, no longer subtraction, and take the opposite of that number. This is the same as this. Do we know how to add that? We just finished that. Yeah. Two numbers, different signs. Subtract the smaller from the larger, which is what? 2, and what's the sign? Positive. So instead of giving you another set of rules, we're saying, no, let's use the same rules that we have, learn them, and just make that extra step. 7 minus a negative 4. Correct. Leave the first one alone. Change this one to a plus and take the opposite of that. What's the opposite of negative 4? 4. 7 plus 4, the same sign. You add them, which is what? 11. Sign is positive. Minus 2, minus 4. Leave the first one alone. Change the subtraction to addition. And change the 4 to what? Negative 4. You adding two numbers of the same sign. So what's the result? Negative 6. So let's give you a few to try. Do we have an answer to that? Let's see. Leave the first one alone. This becomes a plus. And what's the opposite to negative 2? 2. Opposite signs. Subtract the smaller from the larger. 2 from 4, which is what? 2, and what's the sign of the larger? Absolute value larger. Negative. Nine minus a negative 9. Try that. What do we have? 18. Yep, leave the first one alone. Change that to a plus. And the opposite of negative 9, which is what? 9. 9 plus 9? 18. Negative 9 minus 12.1. This will be, leave the first one alone, negative 9. This becomes plus, and this number becomes what? Negative 12.1. The two numbers have the same sign. You add them. Is that 21.1?
Negative.
And the sign will be the same. Keep the sign. Negative 21.1. Couple more, then this section is done. 5 plus negative 6 minus negative 11. If you remember, when it's plus, we don't touch anything. So the first two are going to stay the same till we get to that one. We're going to change it to a plus. So the first two, no change, because these are addition. Here is a subtraction. Change the minus to addition and do what? The opposite of that number, which is what? 11. Let's do the first two. Different signs. Subtract the smaller from the larger. 5 from 6. Negative 1. Very good. It's 1 with the sign minus. Add to it the 11. Notice different signs. Subtract the smaller from the larger, which is what? 10, and the sign is positive. Okay, you try this. I did something on purpose here intentionally. And there's the minus 2 here. I didn't put it in parentheses. Because a lot of times your book doesn't put them in parentheses. Does that mean to change that to a plus? No. Because that's not subtraction. What is that then? Negative. That's really a negative number. I just didn't put it there. So that number is a negative number. Stays the same. I always put them in parentheses, but the book doesn't. This is a subtraction. See that minus? That's subtraction. Make it a plus. And what's the opposite of 3? Negative 3. That's addition. We don't touch it. And that number we don't touch. We only switch the sign when it's subtractions. So the first number was a negative number. Notice all the numbers are negative. If you want, you can just add them and stick the sign in. 2 and 3, 5. 5 and 5, 10. What's the sign? Negative 10. 4 minus 2 minus a negative 3. Now, if you remember the order of operation, you're going to do what? What's inside the parentheses first. Remember that? So let's not pay attention to that 4 in the front. This becomes what? 2. And what are we going to do with that minus sign? Change it to addition, and that number becomes what? What's 2 plus 3? 5. Let's bring the rest of the problem. Here's the minus and there's the 4. Now we have subtractions. What do? Change it to addition and change that number to what? Negative 5. Four plus a negative 5. Different signs. Subtract the smaller from the larger. 4 from 5, which is what? 1. The sign is minus 1. One more of these problems. Do what's inside the parentheses. Where's 3 plus negative 2? What is that equal to? 1. Subtract the smaller from the larger, the sign of the larger. That's 1. Now that becomes the new problem. How do we subtract? Leave the first one, change it to addition, take the opposite of that number. 1 from 7, 6.